1, 2, 3, 4. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Yeah, Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour.
My guest today is Mark T. Jordan. He's a piano man extraordinaire who's worked with a list of countless of my favorite artists over the years, including Van Morrison, Bonnie Raitt, Jackson Browne, Boss Cax, and Roy Parnell. The list goes on and on and on. And he also is part of a more recent band called Big Shoes, and we'll get into that in a moment here. But welcome to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour, Mark.
Thank you very much, Andreas. It's wonderful to be here. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And I'd like to kick it off with Big Shoes, which originated as a Little Feat tribute band.
That's
and
correct.
I've seen you many times at either Douglas Corner or Bourbon Street Blues and Boogie Bar. And would you mind telling me a little bit how Big Shoes came about?
Yes. Well, credit where credit is due. I think we have to give all credit to Andy Peak, our drummer and leader, who had the concept about 6 years ago that, well, as you know, this town is pretty good with after-hours musicians doing tribute bands, all the Hemby Brothers and the Eaglemaniacs and 12 Against Nature and all that stuff. Andy's idea was to do a little bit of a different tribute to an obscure band, Little Feat. Not a lot of people are aware of their work, but those who are seem to be pretty enthusiastic about it, die hard. So Andy got the idea together to form a Little Feat band and look for people who were like-minded, who love that kind of American soup, if you want, and recruited me. And one of the first members of the band was Tom Rohde, the percussionist. Yeah. And I think each of us in his own way, every night before we go out, we just let Tom come through, and we think about him for a second, because he's such a wonderful man, and to lose him, was terrible.
Did he pass before you guys started performing, or did he?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. But typical of Tom is he said, "I've got this guy. I know a friend of mine down in Muscle Shoals who might be interested in coming up for this because he'd be perfect for it." And it was Will McFarland, right? And Will did come up for it, and Will is in the band to this day. And the beautiful corollary to that is that, as you know, Will was involved with Bonnie Raitt's band for many years, and I was involved with Bonnie on a couple of recordings, and she covered a couple of my songs. But we had never played together. In the 45 years of knowing about each other, we had never played in any band or situation together. And so now, this is the first time we've played together. And it's worth the wait, let me tell you that.
Yeah, I was wondering about that, if you might have been part of her band at the same time, because I know Freebo was with her too when Will was, and you guys go back a long way.
That's right, Freebo's gig before he went to Bonnie was with me in my college band, Edison Electric. We were at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia in the late 60s.
Yeah.
Did it one album for Atlantic, and then, like every other band those days, we broke up, And he got Bonnie, and I went west and wound up with Van Morrison.
Did you know the Little Feat guys, or especially Billy Payne back then?
Yes. Particularly, I met them when I lived in Marin County between 70 and 75, because I was working with Warner Brothers quite a bit, Ted Templeman and Lenny Waronker. And then, largely because of the work I was getting, I decided to move my family down to Los Angeles in 76, and then we got quite close to all of those guys. Worked a lot with Nicolette Larson, with Kenny Gradney and Paul and even Billy. Yeah, so we were friends with all of them. Yeah, Lowell not so much because he was on his own wavelength and didn't see him so much, but did run into him. We'd wave and grin at each other in the halls of Warner Brothers down there in Burbank, when we saw each other. But yeah, knew all those guys.
Yeah.
Great guys.
So you've been performing with Big Shoes. I guess in the beginning it was all Little Feat material, and I saw you guys do shows with like the horn section, and it was just great.
Thank you.
When did you guys decide that, wait a minute, this band is so good we might want to try the original route too?
Well, I think it came together or came out organically. We loved playing Little Feat, but not to say that it was ever one-dimensional, because how can you say that about music like that? But nonetheless, we realized that there was more musical real estate we might want to cover that was similar, because we were all drawn by that influence, so we wanted to continue that. And, along with that, we decided, well, if we're going to record, we need to record something that's not Little Feat, because how could you possibly be arrogant enough to think that you could do better than Little Feat if you recorded their stuff? And plus, you're paying royalties, so it was like a non-starter. We can't do this. It's a great live thing, but we got more music in us than this. So we realized that 5 of the 7, or 5.5 of the 7 of us write. So we just started pulling things together and, culling, and I like this one, that one maybe not. Oh, that's very cool. And hey, I just brought this new one in, and so we compiled a list of songs that we thought were in the genre, so to speak, but were something that would be more of a voice for ourselves. Yeah. And that's how we got to where we are right now.
And you had an earlier release a couple of years ago that you pretty much, I guess, sold at gigs, but the new one, Step on It,
yes,
is coming out next week.
It's exactly right. It is exactly right. Wherever fine CDs are sold, and we're pretty excited about it. The first one was just an introduction, and it had a lot of covers, or several blues covers, like what was the Albert King song we covered? We covered "You Upsets Me, Baby," B.B. King, stuff like that.
Yeah,
and a couple of originals. But this one is all originals, and it's a lot more than just blues on there. There's some Memphis soul stew, and we have the Memphis horns on a couple of tracks. Charles Rose was kind enough to do the arrangements for us, and Will supervised that. Will and Andy went down to the shows and recorded them. So we got it all going on. Some great ballads. Rick Huckabee, our lead singer, fabulous writer as well, and he and Kenneth Wright wrote a couple of songs on the album that are very good. So it's something we're all happy about, and that we all feel proud to have done.
Yeah, and going forward, playing shows, is it going to be a mix of Little Feat songs and originals, or is it going to be all original?
What we're thinking of now is to get our originals out there, and then maybe encore with some, if they like us enough, maybe we'll play 2-3 Little Feat songs just to show them where it started, and give our proper tip of the hat, to our biggest influence.
Yeah. So that's now, but let us go back a little bit. And you mentioned the Edison Electric Band that you had back in Philadelphia. And we mentioned Freebo, he was a member of that too. Can you tell me a little bit about that band and about your start as a professional musician?
Well, I was classically trained on the piano from an early age. And so that was sort of my path until I got into high school. And of course, then the Beatles and the Stones came out. Everything changed, right? And concurrently with that, I started at college. So I was surrounded by people who were changing, and a lot of us were into music. So one thing led to another, and I met Freebo through my roommate who was on the football team. We started getting together, and he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I play a little piano." And I said, "What do you do?" He said, "Well, I play a little tuba and bass." And it was like, hey, maybe we ought to start something. And we recruited a guitar player and a drummer who were a year behind us at band. and a lead singer who was at our year, and went out and started covering Stone songs at the fraternities around Penn and stuff like that, and working up stuff. Pretty soon it was Captain Beefheart, and as our tastes broadened, you know, and we were certainly influenced by the whole Philadelphia Gamblin' Huff, Joe Tarsia, uh, that whole era, Spinners, Intruders,
Yeah.
even Bunny Sigler, and all of those great Philadelphia singers. So that formed a little bit of our basis. We started writing, got to the attention of a local producer, and he took us to Joel Dorn, the great jazz producer who was doing work with Atlantic then, Eddie Henderson and stuff like that. And they signed us. We made one record in 1970. And it turned out to be more of a jam band kind of thing than we were anticipating, but that's the reaction people gave it. It was a pretty unrealized effort, but it was our first thing I did commercially. And then I split for the West Coast and started working as a hired gun.
So, what made you move to the West Coast?
Edison had gone to San Francisco in 1968 for the summer just to see what we could see, and we all fell in love with it. I mean, just how could you not? So it was my idea to get back there someday, and it took me 3 years, but I wanted to go back. And after Edison broke up, it seemed like a natural thing to do. So we moved cross country like the grapes of wrath, with everything tied to the car, and found a houseboat in San Rafael, in Marin County, and lived there for a while, and stayed in Marin for 6 years, and then moved to LA, and then to Nashville in '93. So been here 25 years.
Okay.
Mhm.
Who were some of the early musicians you hooked up with in LA or in California?
I kind of did a blind audition for Van Morrison on the advice of my ex-college girlfriend in New York, and nothing else. I mean, it was just like, you'd think I was nuts if you heard me. That was my plan today, but back then it seemed like as good a plan as any. Got on the audition with Van, one-on-one at his house. He said, you know where the studio is, don't you? I said, oh, yeah, sure. And, of course, I didn't know anything. He was referring to the record plant in Sausalito. So I drove it from our little houseboat and found out where it was in advance of the session. And I said, sure. And he said, well, can you be there Friday at noon? And I said, well, let me look on my schedule. And of course, there was no schedule, and had there been, there'd be nothing on it because I just got there. And I said, oh, yeah, I think I'm free. And he said, well, see you then. And I said, fine. So Friday at noon at Sausalito record plant, there's Van and the rest of the band, and we're recording Tupelo Honey. And Ted Templeman is the producer, and that was my first introduction to the West Coast, and to Van, and to Warner Brothers, and to Ted, who was very helpful to me, in using me on stuff.
And Connie Kay played drums on that session.
Yes.
And what a great drummer he was.
He was a fabulous drummer. See, Van really thinks of himself as a jazz singer, and thinks of his voice maybe as an instrument, another instrument, right? And if you think of it that way, it's obvious, or it's easier to see that he thought maybe Tupelo Honey was a jazz song, and thus it needed a jazz drummer, right? So when the rest of us, Ronnie Montrose on guitar and Bill Church on bass, and me, were maybe rock and rollers, Connie was a jazzer, and that's what he brought to it, and that's what you hear on the recording. And pretty well magic. He's used that progression in 3 or 4 other songs since then, but that was the template for all of them. Yeah, pretty much a classic.
And you did the same Dominic's Preview album too.
Well, actually, yes. As it turned out, Van is nothing, Andreas, if not prolific. I mean, the guy it just pours out of him. Sure did back then. And we often recorded more tracks than we needed for an album, but he was just exploding out of him, you know. So actually, what happened is that a couple of those tracks that, or both, I think, of the tracks that I played on St. Dominic's were left over from Tupelo Honey. Didn't make the original cut, and they were used on St. Dominic's, which was the subsequent album. But yeah, same session.
Okay. Did you hit the road with him too after that session, or was that just a studio collaboration?
Originally, it was just a studio collaboration. We did a couple of gigs around town. During that period in his life, he hadn't come to terms with the facing an audience every night like he has for the last 25 years. And it was often dependent on the mood he picked up from them, you know, as to whether which fan you might want to see that night. And I remember we did this one gig because Ronnie particularly, but all of us were saying, man, this is a great band. Let's go do some gigs. Somebody, I don't know who, booked a gig in East Bay of San Francisco. If you're familiar with it, it can be a little rough. And we went to this bar. We were booking this bar called Frenchie's, and it turns out it was a reds and wine bar, you know, pills and wine. And so we got there, and he was so put off by the atmosphere, which was a little dark, you know, that he did the whole show with his back to the audience. Whole show, looking at the drummer. Now, where most people's reaction would have been, what an idiot, or who is it? It only added to his mystique because people were so blown away that this guy wouldn't even look at him, you know, and did the whole show. But if you close your eyes, you could hear him singing, you know, from the roots of his toes. So he wasn't skimping, he just wasn't looking. And but it just blew people's minds that he was able to do that. And so rather than putting him down, it sort of raised him up. People were talking about, man, did you see that show he did? And he didn't even face the audience. It's unbelievable. So he'd do things like that. But yeah, so it was sporadic. And then I had heard through the grapevine that Dave Mason was recruiting a keyboard player. And of course, when you say Dave Mason, you say Traffic. And when you say Traffic, you say Steve Winwood. And when you say Steve Winwood, I'm all over it. Because Steve is still a hero to me, even though he's still younger than me. How did that work? I don't understand.
He started out real young.
Didn't he ever?
Davis.
Yeah, 16 when he did I'm a Man. Yeah. But yes, so I had known all of that Traffic stuff because I just adored, and still do, Steve Winwood. So when they asked me to come down and audition, it was like, I got this. And I did. And I toured for Dave for 2.5 years, 3 years, and did 3 albums with him.
He's such a great songwriter too. I mean,
oh man,
you don't know, like, and
you know that first
All Right
album
and all that stuff.
Oh yeah,
it's all on there.
Oh yeah, and that first album, Alone Together, just one hit after another. Yeah, he always had real muscular bands too. Real, everybody could play. His foil for many years when I was in the band and after was Jimmy Krieger, the guitar player from Wisconsin, Manitowoc, Wisconsin, who wrote We Just Disagree, if you remember that other hit that he had. So yeah, great players all the time.
Yeah.
And some fun adventures we had. Yeah.
And going back to Van Morrison, your association with him didn't stop then, though. You've done work with him more recently, too.
Yeah. Well, Van's one of those people who I guess has a big, fat mental Rolodex because, you know, after a while, you get around to the front of the thing and he calls you again. So I guess I appeared on 3 albums with him. He called me back after I moved to L.A., called me back in 78 to work on an album called Into the Music in Marin County. And we did that, I believe, at the record plant in Sausalito as well. And then in 76, before I left for Los Angeles, we went into the record plant and did something that was never released, a whole album's worth of stuff, or material. I don't know if it was an album, but enough material for an album. I remember he was playing sax like a maniac at the time. That was his, he focuses. He'll play guitar for a couple of months. He'll play harp for a couple of months. He'll play sax. He goes around. So this was one of his sax periods, and we recorded a lot. Never came out. And then when Philosopher's Stone came out in, I think, 2004, Bonnie, no, maybe 1994, because I was on the road, I guess, with Bonnie, and Hutch Hutchinson came up to me and said, "Oh, you're out on a new Van Morrison album. It's brilliant." And I said, "Well, you're crazy, because I haven't played with Van for 20 years, 16 years." And no, he said, "No, just go get this album." So we were at Caesars in Vegas. I went to, Best Buy or whatever, and there it was. And there were 5 tracks that I played on Philosopher's Stone. I went, "What the?" I opened it up and saw the credits, and I was like, "Oh, this is the stuff we did in 1976." And he has volumes, of material to choose from. So he just went through the files and picked them out, and like that. So fortunately, again. And then the last time I played with him, I toured Europe in 2005 for 5 months. And that was the last time I was with him.
Yeah. So we left it off with you being in Dave Mason's band.
Yeah.
Did you get Bonnie Raitt's gig after that, or how did that evolve?
Well, interestingly enough, I'd been knowing Bonnie all along, because she and Edison Electric, my college band, shared a manager, and that's someone I bet you know, and that's Dick Waterman.
Yeah.
You know Dick?
Not personally, but
Rob,
I
you know
certainly
who I'm talking about. Wonderful manager, and at the time that he met Bonnie, he started out as a sports reporter, and he was from the University of Massachusetts, and then he went up to Cambridge and started booking Club 47 with Jim Rooney, right down here, and he managed Son House, Mississippi John Hurt, and Sippy Wallace. And Bonnie was a Cliffy. She was a Radcliffe girl, a Harvard female school at that time. They weren't co-ed. And she started hanging out in the folkies, because that was kind of where she was coming from. Met Dick. He turned her on to Sippy Wallace and all these other guys playing slide guitar, and was like, her eyes way open. She loved that. So with the determination that she brings to everything that she ever does, she started learning how to play slide guitar. And pretty soon she was the only woman who played acoustic slide guitar. So Dick managed us and managed her, and we were sort of like both at the very beginning of our careers at the time. And after Edison broke up, and while I was with Dave Mason, we had a 2-week hiatus, and Bonnie called 3 of the 4 of us in Edison, minus the drummer, up to Bearsville to record, to be the core band for her record Give It Up. So that's the first time I recorded with her, and that was 1972, right? And then I wrote a couple of songs that Freebo got to her for me, very sweet of him, and she recorded, and one was on the record Home Plate in 75, I think, called Walked Out the Front Door. And we cover this on Big Shoes record, on this new record, Step On It. And in 1977, she put out a LP called Sweet Forgiveness. That was the one that had Runaway as the single on it, the Del Shannon song. And I had a song on there that I wrote myself called Two Lives. And she did 2 of those songs. And then in 94, she invited me back on the road to play in the band that included George Marinelli, whom you know very well, Ricky Fattar, Hutch Hutchinson, and Deborah Dobkin and Glenn Clark. Right, Deborah on percussion and Glenn on.
And that Road Tested live record
Yes,
is so good.
Isn't that a good record?
And there are all these great people guesting on it too.
Oh my God, that was so wonderful. That was extraordinary time, That was 94, 95. And then she invited me back for a couple of gigs in 98 on the road in the West Coast. So we stay in touch, We see each other or say hi every once a year or something like that.
Yeah. And you mentioned your songwriting. How did your songwriting evolve? You're mainly known as a piano keyboard player, but you had cuts early on with Bonnie.
Well, I did and Bonnie and a couple of other people. It occurred to me. Well, I had to write for Edison Electric, and first of all, we kind of had to find out what the hell kind of band we wanted to be, and we were young, but we were just getting our influences together. But we were, we liked R&B, we liked Motown, we liked Philly, we liked funk, So we tried to, as much as we were able at a young age, to try and capture some of that. So had to write, and both the drummer and the lead singer were both excellent lyric writers, and Phoebo contributed a couple songs too. So we all wrote, and that's when I started, and I was very fortunate to be introduced to a guy named Graham Gouldman when I had just gotten out of college. And Graham Gouldman co-founded 10cc, the English group.
Yeah.
And before that, he was an independent, successful young songwriter. The first song he ever got recorded was, what's the Yardbirds? Not For Your Love, but Heart Full of Soul.
Yeah.
First song. For Your Love was the second song. The third and fourth songs he got recorded, Bus Stop and Look Through Any Window. Right? So that's how he started his career. And we've been friends since 1969. And he and his manager, Harvey Lisberg, have been dear, dear friends to me. So early on, I started thinking, there's more to this than just playing. I mean, if you write something, you see little mailbox monies. And I always enjoyed the process. Yeah, of what's the word? Prosody. That is the marriage of music and words.
Yeah.
It's like a puzzle. I really, really admire great lyricists for that reason. Being as that's where I struggle. Music's not so hard for me, but the lyrics are always a bit difficult.
Is the music where a lot of your songs start?
I would have to say, yeah. In terms of something that I hum to myself or sing to myself that I think has potential, and I'll go to the piano or keep it in my head for, as long as I can until I can get to a piano and say, where is this going? Maybe notate it if it's something that I want to come back to. Yeah.
So when you got off the road with Bonnie the first time, what did you do next?
I was in L.A. by that time. I met Jackson Browne. He was just completing the Pretender album, looking for a band to go out. And I went out with him all through 1976 and half of 1977 on the road. And that was just after he lost his wife, Phyllis, and had two young boys, both under 5 to bring up. It was a pretty heavy time. He's a remarkable man. He's an old soul by anybody's measurement. And his dad was Django Reinhardt's pianist.
I didn't know
Did
that.
you know that?
No, I did not.
Yes, it's true. So he comes by it, honest. Although where you can get a 19-year-old to write something like Take It Easy is beyond me. But anyway, that's one of his gifts. He's a real prince. I worked for Olivia Newton-John. I was her musical director on her world tour of Totally Hot when she sort of came out of the I Honestly Love You period and got a little more aggressive.
She recorded in this room too.
Did she?
She did the Don't Stop Believing album here.
Olivia is just a regular gal. She is so cool. Loved everything about her. Fun, funny, classy, really good. I saw her, listen, this is the first time she'd been back to Australia since she emigrated. This was 78, right? So it was a big deal. And so she had an opening act. And do you know the African singer Labi Siffre?
Yeah.
He was her opening act in Australia. Now, mind you, Australia is a fabulous place, but the question with the Aboriginals and the natives is not resolved, right? So, on many stops, or several anyway, at Sydney certainly, he would sing I Honestly Love You with her. And there was some sub-rosa little tension in the crowd, And especially when they finished the song, she'd take him by the hand and walk out to the edge of the stage and just stand there, smiling, not waving, not talking, not moving, just holding his hand and smiling. And almost invariably, it was reluctant. But what would happen was when people would, the volume would go down, there'd be a little bit of awkward silence, and it would start to come up again. And pretty soon, the damn place, they were on their feet, because they understood what she was doing. And I never forgot that, She didn't even have to say anything. And there it was. And she said everything she had to say. And it was beautiful. Oh, unbelievable. Worked with her, went over to England, worked with Graham Gouldman on the last 10cc as a band album, 10 out of 10, which at that point was him and Eric Stewart only. Lal Cream and Kevin Godley had left years ago. And even Eric and Graham was doing his half in their studio outside of Manchester, and Eric was doing his half in their studio outside of London. So they didn't even, So it was about to still be called a band as you could get it. And then, I messed around for a few years in the 80s, and came back with Rita Coolidge in 90, and Edgar Winter first, and then, Rita Coolidge for about a year, and then Edgar Winter for about a year. And then I got married to my darling wife, Peggy, and we started coming out here and thinking, this is a lot better than L.A. in terms of affordability and seasons. I grew up on the East Coast, so seasons are kind of something I remember, rather fond of, So we came out here in 93 and never looked back.
And I guess just slightly before that, you played on a Taj Mahal album that I love.
Oh, yeah.
Like Never Before.
Yeah, that on Private Records. That was a boutique label. And, my friend Skip Drinkwater was one of the producers on that. It was a great record. It had a John Martin song and a couple other great songs. I had 2 songs on that album that I'd co-written. Yeah, I'd played with Taj, known him in L.A., run into him. And, of course, with Bonnie's Association, there was always some place where they were playing on the same bill. So we got to say hi, and I sat in with her on occasion. So we knew each other, and I always admired his work and what a historian he was, and a teller of tales. But, Taj can tell you who played bass on a Ruth Brown session in 1954. I would really like to follow him around with a tape recorder for about 3 months. I think it's, he's got a lot to impart. Yeah. I'd like to be maybe one of the ones who captured it, but that's something for another day. But yes, loved Taj. So when this opportunity came up, I said, I am there. And then we took him on tour through the States, 6 weeks, and then another 4 weeks in Europe. And it was great. Full band, 2 keyboards, setups. Each of us had 2 keyboards, doing horns and all. We tried to do as much of the album as possible.
Yeah.
2 guitar players, slide, killer rhythm section from Philadelphia. Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, and then you moved here. Was Leroy Parnell one of the early collaborators here?
Well, oddly enough, 6 months after I got here, we got here, my wife and I. It was when Bonnie asked me to go out. So my first 2 years, I was kind of out with her. But yes, Leroy is kind of my neighbor down the street in Westmead, and so we'd see each other around, and we started playing together. And again, I love his story. He's a historian. His dad's really close friend was Bob Wills, and Leroy growing up, and his brother Rob Roy used to call him Uncle Bob because that's how often he was around the house. And Leroy's first gig was at 8 years old, literally standing on a soapbox, singing a song at a Bob Wills show. So I love that. And I love his playing. He's a funny guy. We've toured together as well. And Leroy led to Delbert, that whole crew. Gary Nicholson, all those people. So, yeah.
Yeah. There's another project you did here in Nashville, the Joyride Project. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Oh, thank you for remembering that. 2 dear friends of mine, Scott Chambers, bass player extraordinaire. He used to be in Jack Mack and the Heart Attack back in L.A., and lead singer, co-writer, fabulous vocalist, and a great friend, C.C. Miller. We just loved that jump jazz of the 30s and 40s. And we wanted to do something that was sort of like quick and guerrilla and didn't need to be a whole setup and like 14 musicians trying to get places and stuff. So he said, let's just do a trio, piano, bass, and vocals, and we'll all sing background vocals too, and we'll make it, we did a lot of Nat Cole, Sweet Lorraine, Are You For It, kind of stuff like that. A lot of early Ray Charles, a lot of Johnny Mercer, all of that stuff. We love that era, and we put out a self-financed record in 2015, I think, called Are You For It, which was the name of the song we covered of Nat Cole's that was his first single in 1935, I believe. Yeah, so that was a lot of fun. Yeah, those we're scattered now because CeCe has moved to Rockport, Texas, and Scott has gone back to being a real estate developer here in Nashville.
It's a good place to be for
oh boy, I think he's done pretty well, but he sure is still a mean bass player and a very sweet guy. We've known each other. We've all known each other a long time, so it was a labor of love, and we had a hoot doing it. Yeah, I'd like to do it one more time. We got well, there's certainly enough songs. The golden era.
Yeah. You mentioned Delbert and all that. Did you meet Andy Peake through the Delbert connection? Because I know he worked with him for a short while too.
Yeah. Oddly enough, I met Andy, one of the first people I met, players I met when I first came to town 25 years ago. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was on a Mila Mason gig. Dino Zimmerman was in the band, the guitar player who was wonderful. He used to work at Malaco a long time and died 3 or 4 years ago. And Donnie Wynn, who I also met, who worked with Deborah Allen, who I first worked with in '93. But yeah, I think I met Andy on a road gig somewhere. Yeah, and we circulated for a while, and then would play in a little pickup. I kept running into him, and by '95, I was using him on demos, and I liked the way he played, and so we've been friends really since all the time I've been here. Yeah, ups and downs. Watched his daughter grow up, and now she's hitting it in New York and L.A. as a songwriter. Maggie Peake, great. Yeah.
Yeah. Somebody else you've been working with occasionally that is a mutual friend of ours too is John Tiven.
Oh, I love John. Yeah.
You ended up on a few records that he produced. How did you meet him?
That's a good question. I want to say it was something like the Bluebird, but it might have been something more personal, like he had me over to the house to record or something on one of his projects. I know there was some involvement with Cropper that we were doing, and that might have been it. But in maybe 2000 or 2002, John put a review, I guess you could call it that, an R&B review together behind Ellis Hooks, and took us to the Perugia.
The Paretta Soul Festival.
Well, actually, it wasn't Paretta; it was Perugia.
Okay.
Paretta's down the road, but this was the Perugia Jazz Festival, and we were there for 2 weeks in a hotel, played our little gigs. Unfortunately, we couldn't see a lot of the headliners, and I'm talking about like Keith Jarrett and Dionne Warwick, and big. They were in the soccer field, they had one of those big portable inflatable stages. But we played like in the town squares and stuff, but it was usually around like noon and 9 o'clock at night, so we never got to see any of the headliners, but it was a fabulous time. And Junelle Mosser went with us, and Patty Russo, who used to be Meatloaf's female foil on stage, had a great time.
Was Sir Mac Rice on that tour too? The guy who wrote Mustang Sally, Sir Mac Rice.
Oh yeah, Sir Mac Rice. Yes, he was.
I went.
We backed him up. And Cadillac Assembly Line, and
I went to see you guys perform at the Paretta Soul Festival. Before I moved here.
Oh my God!
And Billy Block was the drummer.
Yes.
And
you're absolutely right.
So that was great. That's when I met John. I met Wayne Jackson.
Yes.
At that same festival.
That's right. He was on horns. He and Was it Andrew?
That was after Andrew retired.
That's
but,
right. That's right.
But
Yes.
he was there.
Before he was sick, but after he retired, right. Yes, I remember that very well. Yeah, unbelievable. See?
Yeah. You also work with Lyle Lovett.
I did, and I have Matt Rawlings to thank for that. When I got to town, I didn't know very many people. Actually, the people who brought me to town in terms of encouraging me were Ken Vassy and his wife Carol. And if you remember, Ken was the second lead singer, if you want to say that, in the first edition, behind Kenny Rogers. Had the beautiful high tenor voice. Carol was his wife. And I knew the LeBounties, Bill and Becky Foster, his wife. And so I called up Becky one day after I'd sort of been here a month and figured out, oh, well, Matt Rawlings is the guy I need to talk to, you know. And I called up Becky and I said, Becky, do you know Matt? And she said, of course. I said, would you mind brokering a meeting between him and me? And she was kind enough to do it. And at the time, he was living over on Walnut off of Woodmont. And I caught him one morning and he was kind of like running around. He said, oh, geez, I got a for sale sign in the front yard. I've been thinking about selling a house, but I really haven't thought about it. I haven't looked at anything else. And now this morning, my broker calls me and says, hey, you got your offer. So I don't know what to do. I said, well, I got an idea. There's a house across the street from me in Westmead that has a basement studio in it of, 1,500 square feet. He came over, looked at it, bought it. So he was my neighbor for, I don't know, 8 years or so before he moved to L.A. And so in 96, he had enough to do in the studio and that sort of thing that Lyle asked him to go out on the yearly tour. And he was very generous in giving it to me and suggesting me. So Lyle had me out. My audition was the Tonight Show, and they flew me out to play the One-Eyed Fiona and flew me back. And then called me a day later and said, okay, you got it. And I went out on the Rodan Sonata tour in summer and fall of 96. That was quite an experience. Lyle's amazing cat.
Was Charles Ross and Harvey Thompson in the band at that time?
They were indeed, and John John Hagen, and Andrea Zahn, which is where I first got to know Andrea, and the singers, Pee Wee and Sir Harry, Sweet Pea and Sir Harry and Willie Green and Francine Reed. Yeah, so that was a pretty funny bus. Yeah, I love that music. And Ray Herndon, of course, on guitar.
Yeah. Was Russ Kunkel the drummer at that time?
No, it was Dan. Dan, can't remember his last name, but wonderful guy. Quiet, but just right there. And Victor Krause on bass.
Yeah, and he's still with him, too.
Victor, monster. Victor and Allison and Andrea Zahn all grew up in Champaign-Urbana.
Okay.
Right? And Andrea was like a few years behind Victor and Andrea, so she won all the fiddle contests after Andrea did, right? And her after Allison did, and Andrea's father was also a music educator in the I guess university system there. Okay. So they're similar, came from similar backgrounds.
Yeah, one thing I love about the large band shows is like each player, gets the spotlight. And to me, it's like, at least just watching the show, Lyle is such a great band leader, such a great master of what's happening on stage. Can you elaborate a little bit on his role in that band?
Oh, not only is he a great band leader, but if you'll notice, I think you'll agree that his persona comes off as very self-deprecating, painfully so in some instances, and it's sort of like almost a leitmotif, if you will, all right, through the thing, and it's very effective, right, because he's always being downtrodden. He's like, Francine is always calling him out for something, or somebody else is, dumping on his parade. But that calculation is scripted within an inch of its life every night, and it works. But it's very deceptive, because you think like nothing's happening, or there's no there, you know, because he's not very forceful, and he's, even when he sings sometimes he's a little bit tentative, you know. But that all works to his advantage, and he has got it down to a science. Timing, everything, yeah. And I love how he features different players. It brings the band alive instead of being one block front of people, you know, personalities emerge. It's a wonderful way to keep the interest up, you know. And then the songs are just great. I mean, his amalgam of his particular lyric take with the Texas forms that he uses is genius, in my estimation. Genius. And nobody does it better.
Yeah. So we're getting towards the end of the program.
Boy, time flies when you're having
It sure
fun.
does. But do you feel like we missed talking about something that's dear to your heart? Or a main collaborator we missed?
No, but I would like to play a song if we have time.
I'd love for you to.
You're talking about main collaborators, and one of them has been Charles John Corto. Do you know Charles?
I don't.
Wow, my goodness. You might want to meet him. Interesting fellow. He's a poet and a psychic. He wrote Mama Knows the Highway for Hal Ketchum. He wrote Geronimo's Cadillac for Michael Martin Murphey, and 100 other lesser-known songs. But he has a way with words. See what you think. This is called Even the Night's Got the Blues. Me and Charles. There's a train coming in, made of rain and gin. Train going by like a friend. There's a drift in the air from God knows where. Someplace my heart has been. There's a tomcat howling on a neighbor's roof. Well, I believe him 100 proof, 'cause I was already right in the mood. Even the night's got the blues. Even the night's got the blues, hanging around with nothing to lose, and nothing is lost on the moon. Even the night's got the blues. Isn't that what gave Lonesome its name? Worldwide, wide now. Isn't that what made Mississippi John hurt deep inside? There's a poor fool crying in every room, spilling sugar on the bitter truth. The morning paper won't come as news. Even the night's got the blues. Even the night's got the blues, hanging around with nothing to lose and nothing the night's got the blues. Even the night has got the blues.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you for having me today. I really enjoyed this.
Thanks for being here, and Step on It, the new Big Shoes album, is coming out next week.
Yes.
It's already gotten great reviews.
Yeah.
I scanned the internet earlier today, and it's just every review is just stellar, and they embrace the musicianship, obviously.
We're just delighted and stunned at the same time to have this kind of recognition, at this stage of the game. But it's so much fun, and we're grateful to the fans and who are enthusiastic, the listeners. Encourage you to go get the album and come out and see us on March 28th at 3rd and Lindsley for our CD release party.
All right. I will be there for sure.
Great.
And I hope we get to collaborate again in the future.
Me too. Look forward to it.
All right. Thanks for being my guest today.
Thank you, Andreas.
This was the 27th episode of the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. We taped it at Buzz Cason's legendary Creative Workshop recording studio in the Berry Hill neighborhood of Nashville. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next week.